Sunday school leader. We finished the unit on 1 John last week, and so this week we're going to be beginning a new 6-week unit on walking with confidence. And so for 6 weeks we're going to be in the book of Genesis, and we'll take a 1-week break for a Thanksgiving lesson. Now the title of this Sunday's lesson is The Basis for Our Confidence, from the first 8 verses of Genesis chapter 12. And the point of this lesson is confidence comes from trusting God. So for the next several weeks we're going to be examining the life of Abraham, or Abram, as he was first known. And by the way, I'm going to sometimes use the name Abraham when referring to Abram and Sarah to refer to Sarai, even before their names were changed. It sometimes just helps me remember, okay? Anyway, so before we dive into this week's text, let's get a little bit of background on what's going on here. Now, earlier in Genesis, of course, we have the story of Noah and the flood. Now, do you remember the names of his 3 sons? They were Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Okay, we can look in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 26, and see that Abraham, was a descendant of Noah's son Shem. And in fact, Shem was Abram's 7th great-grandfather. Now, I've led a couple of in-depth studies of the families of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I've got to say, dysfunction definitely is not new to modern society. All right, let's take a look at this genealogy chart, and I think you'll see what I mean. So at the top you see Terah, and Terah is the father of Abraham, and then Abraham's brothers, Nahor and Haran. And we learn in Genesis 20 that Abraham and Sarah, or Sarai, were half siblings, sharing a father but not a mother. All right, so then as we look over on the far right of this chart, we see that Haran had a daughter, Milcah, and she married her uncle, Nahor. All right, their union produced Bethuel, who is the father of Rebekah. Now, Rebekah married Isaac, had been her first cousin once removed. Now, the union of Isaac and Rebekah produced the twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob married 2 of his uncle Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, who would, of course, been his first cousins on his mother's side, and they would have also been Jacob's second cousins once removed on his father's side. So you can see what I mean about dysfunction, okay? Yet the Lord worked through this dysfunctional family, this dysfunctional line, to form a line of descendants through whom the Messiah would come. But that's not where the confusion ends. All right, we know that Old Testament names can be difficult for us to pronounce, can't they? But sometimes the names of people can be the same as the names of places, and that kind of compounds the confusion. Now, such is the case with this family. Now, follow the chart as I read Genesis 11, verses 27 and 28. Here's what it says. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Okay, so the ESV states verse 28 this way: Haran died in the presence of his father Terah. Okay, then we look on in verses 31 and 32. It says, Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, together, and they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. So Terah's son Haran died before his father, perhaps in Terah's presence, and Terah died in the place called Haran. So it's enough to kind of make your head spin, isn't it? Now, granted, some translations will double the R in Haran to mean the place, to differentiate it from the person Haran. The NIV does that, the ESV does not. Now, in Hebrew, the 2 nouns, Haran and Haran, begin with different consonants. So to the original reader, there was no problem differentiating between the 2. The person, Haran, begins with what I'll call the soft H, Haran. And the place begins with a hard guttural H, Haran. All right, so there's your language lesson for the week. So still, another interesting point about what I just read from chapter 11 is that Terah, Abraham's father, is setting out for Canaan, but settled in a place called Haran. Could it be that God called Terah to take his family to Canaan, but he didn't complete the mission? So God then called his son Abraham Abram to complete the task? We don't know. But it's interesting to me that Canaan was the original destination that Terah was taking his family to. Now, I'd like to bring out one more thing about the background material. Genesis 11:30 tells us that not only did Sarai have no children, but that she could not have any children because she was barren. Now, barren, that's a harsh word, isn't it? It's so final. But we know that what we think is final isn't always the end of the story for God. Now let's look at our beginning verses in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Here we see the call of Abram. God asked Abram to do one thing, to leave the place where you are now, which would have been the place called Haran, where Abram's father settled earlier. And he was to go where? Well, to the land that God would show him. Basically, just follow me, and I will tell you when we get there that you've arrived. Sometimes God calls us to a specific task, and we know exactly what it is that he wants us to do. And other times he just calls us to follow him. In fact, that's how it was with Jesus when he called his disciples, wasn't it? He just issued the invitation, follow me. Jesus didn't tell them up front what they were going to be doing or where they were going to be going or what was going to be in store for them in the future. No, he just said, follow me. And I think about my own call into ministry. In 1994, I had been a mainframe computer programmer in banking for about 10 years. Had a good job, had a daughter in the first grade, and was very active in the small church that our family attended. If God had somehow revealed to me that I would be at the church that I am in right now, which is only about a 20-minute drive from the church we were at 25 years ago, I would have probably looked for some shortcuts to get here. Instead, what did? We sold our house, moved to Fort Worth. We were there for 3 years, and my first ministry position was 5 years in Liberal, Kansas, and then to Mountain Home, Arkansas for 4 years, and then we've been here in Whitehall, Arkansas for 14 years. We made the big circle. Had I known when we left Redfield that just in 12 years we're going to be just a few miles down the road, I wouldn't have been open to those other ministry opportunities. I would have just looked for something closer to here. But instead, what happened? I gained experience that matured me, that prepared me for what I'm doing right now today. And I also gained some lasting friendships along the way as well. And had we not been in Mountain Home, my daughter would have not met her now husband of 12 years, and we wouldn't have those 2 wonderful grandchildren that we have now. So all this to say, what Psalm 119, 105 tells us, that God's Word is a lamp unto our feet and a light to our path. And when God reveals himself to us, whether it's through the reading of his Word, or through his indwelling Spirit, his revelation lights the path just enough for our next step. So remember, in biblical times, there weren't spotlights. Okay, you couldn't look down the path and see your final destination. No, a handheld lamp emitted just enough light for you to take the next step. And that's where faith in God comes in, that he will get you to the final destination. You don't need to see it, just trust him one step at a time. All right, let's go back to Abram, okay? We see that God promised him a 7-fold blessing. God would make him a great nation. The name Abram means exalted father. Now, he and his wife had no children, and God was going to make him a great nation. Well, unlikely in human terms, right? Especially when we consider his age. It was 75 years. We're going to see that in our next verse, in verse 4. A great nation would come from a 75-year-old man with his barren wife? Again, unlikely. But that's what God promised. As well as the fact that blessings were going to follow him and be bestowed on those who blessed him. Now, as we look on in verses 4 through 6, we see that Abram obeyed. And as Hebrews 11:8 tells us, he didn't know where he was going. He just followed God. Right? They left the place called Haran and made it to Shechem in Canaan. Now, let's look at this map for a moment. Originally, with Terah, the family traveled from Ur, a city in the southeast Mesopotamia, and headed toward Canaan, which was due west. However, Terah and his family traveled northwest to Haran, which is about the halfway point, but why didn't they just go straight across? Why didn't they just go due west? Wouldn't that have been the quickest way? So why didn't they do that? Well, it's because it was the best way to go. Directly between Ur and Canaan was and is a desert. It's been very difficult to cross that. Well, verse 6 ends with a seemingly obvious statement. The Canaanites were in the land. Well, who else would have been there? It was Canaan. Of course it would have been the Canaanites. Why even mention this, right? For one, it was to show that the land was inhabited. Okay, we're going to see in the next set of verses that God promised this land to his offspring. Again, promising a 75-year-old man and his barren wife offspring was seemingly impossible, right? Also, Abram didn't come with an army to drive out the Canaanites from this land. So how is this going to happen, right? Again, this is where faith and patience come into play. All right, also, the Canaanites were evil people, and God called Abram and his family to this area. Now, even today, God calls people to areas that aren't safe. And similarly, he calls pastors to areas that aren't ideal as well. You know, there's a sister church down the road from us a few miles. They're looking for a music minister and having a very difficult time doing that. And what they're finding out is really not too many people want to move to the Pine Bluff, Arkansas area. Well, that's a shame. That's pretty sad, isn't it? You know, when a person's called by God to follow him, I don't think we have the right to put qualifications on that, now do we? Right? Okay, now it's easy for us to sit in judgment of those ministers who don't want to follow God completely wherever he leads, but as you know, not everyone in your class is called into what I'm going to call professional ministry. And I say that because, of course, all believers are called to minister, therefore they are called into ministry. All right, so that's just to differentiate that. So how can this apply to them? How can this apply to people in your class? Well, in my 23 years as a minister of education, I've run into some strong-willed classes in my time. Classes that didn't want to move, didn't want to change rooms, didn't want to create a new class. You know, it's like Josh Hunt says. He says, I'm not asking you to pack up and move across the world. I'm just asking you to move down the hall. All right? God doesn't call your class to be comfortable, but to grow. And what's that going to take? Is it going to take getting rid of tables, moving to another room? You see, comfort is the enemy of growth. All right, we'll get off my soapbox. Let's get back to our text, the last two verses, 7 and 8. Here we see that God promised Abram this land to his offspring. And Abram, what did he do? He built an altar to the Lord at Shechem. Then he went west between Ai and Bethel and built another altar to the Lord. Just like Abram, when we follow God and we fully trust him, worship will be a natural response. Now, your confidence in yourself, it's going to grow, it's going to wane, depending on your circumstances. But our confidence in God, our trust in him, should only increase as we mature in our faith. The more we trust in God, the more we discover that his promises are true, the more that our confidence grows in him. Confidence and trust go hand in hand. Well, next week we're going to continue in Genesis chapter 13, confidence in the midst of conflict. Please share my link to my Prep Talk for Explore the Bible series with your fellow teachers who use that curriculum. I'd appreciate your doing that. Okay, don't forget to pray for and with your class this week. Again, I really appreciate your watching. Thank you.